Thank you for listening to the Mujeres Create podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Mujeres Create podcast. Thank you again for joining me on the Behind the Success series. This is episode 2, The Big Move and Growing in Unexpected Places. So, the first episode was all about how I got my first job in media, working for NBC Universal, Telemundo, and Mundos. At the time, this was 2004, I was working in Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. And that role was really the stepping stone I needed to get my career kicked off, to initiate my path in media and sales and marketing. One of the things you're told when you're a sales assistant is that you have to do that role for a few years before you get to the next step, which is sales planner. So I was ready to do all of that. And I was happy to do all of that because I would see sales planner in on the floor, and I was very inspired by that next step. Unexpectedly, that next step for me came exactly a year and 6 months after becoming a sales assistant. A role opened up on the team, and I raised my hand. I'm like, I want to go for the role. I felt that I was definitely probably not ready for that yet, especially after hearing people say that you have to be a sales assistant for sometimes up to 5 years or even more before you kind of get considered for those roles, especially at a place like NBC. NBC is definitely known to have a lot of people aspiring to sales planner roles, account executive roles. So I was ready to wait my turn. But at the same time, I always also heard, just raise your hands. You have nothing to lose. So that's what I did. I raised my hands. I applied for the role. And to my surprise, I got the role. And, it was an opportunity that it was amazing for me to see myself getting promoted so quickly and at such a early age. And, I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I just, again, I'm always kind of the type of mentality that, you know, thinks positively and knows that I will always figure it out. So I got into that role, and something I was not ready for was I lasted only 6 months in that role because the next opportunity would come up very soon after getting that promotion. These were very early days for me, obviously, in my career. At that point, that though I had gotten my first mentor, and this is someone I'm going to talk a lot about in future episodes. But I had already started to get some mentorship, and she's one of the people that told me, just raise your hands. You have nothing to lose. So yeah, I raised my hand and I got the sales planner role. As a planner, is the next step. You're working a little bit closer with the executives on strategy, on planning advertising campaigns, on managing communication with advertising agencies, on managing communication with the sales directors, monitoring that, your media buys are actually delivering to advertising clients and that everything is running correctly. So you do have a higher level of responsibility as a sales planner. So I stepped into that role and I embraced it and I loved it. What I was not prepared for was that my next opportunity to actually become a seller and account executive would come 6 months after becoming a planner. So if you know anything about media, or if you've been in the media space, and especially in sales roles, you know that those roles are very difficult to come by, especially at a place like NBC. There's a lot of competition for sales planners who want to become account executives, who want to go to that next level. The next level is selling advertising campaigns, going out to meetings, traveling the country, doing presentations in front of people, reporting, revenue goals, reporting, how your accounts are doing. You have a responsibility for a list of accounts. Sometimes you could have a list of 10 accounts that you have to monitor. The accounts can be Macy's, Toyota, McDonald's, Old Navy. These are some of the accounts that I had at the time. All of these different accounts, you're responsible for them. So it's a huge level of responsibility to step into that account executive role. So as a planner, only being there for 6 months, I definitely was nowhere near thinking about, becoming a seller at that age, at that point. But one day, and that week in the office was a little bit tense because, it was I think it was early winter, and in early winter, like people are just kind of like trying to get through it. I was one of them. And a lot of people in the office were starting to be late in the office. They were coming in like 10, 15, 20 minutes late, 30 minutes late. And the head of sales for the office, he's someone who's been in the industry for many years, very senior. He's still in the industry. This man was the head of sales for all of Telemundo Network, and he was also overseeing Mundo's operations. You know, he had a very intimidating demeanor. I had a good relationship with him because, again, I was very junior. I think it was a little bit harder if you're a seller or a sales manager because it was very intimidating, very serious, very demanding. One of those managers that you're just afraid of. You never know what to expect when you walk into the office. And that week, I feel like a lot of us were coming in late. You know, nothing crazy, like 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. I was one of those people that were sometimes late to the office in the morning. I was commuting from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and sometimes we all know the train situation can be crazy. I had been late a few days that week, and you know, he talked to everybody in the office, and he said, "I'm watching you guys. You have to be early in the office. If I catch anyone being late, you're gonna have an issue." And so I heard that loud and clear. I was so afraid. But that morning, I was coming up on the elevator. It was like 9:15. I was late to the office. And I was just sweating because I was so nervous that he was going to catch me walking in late. And I'm just like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm late again. I'm definitely going to get fired today. That was the thought that I had as the elevators were opening on my floor. I go into the office, I go into my cube, and I sit down, so nervous. And 2 seconds later, my boss, who reports to this manager, to the head of sales, calls me in. He says, "Yesenia, come into my office." And I said, "Oh my God, there it is. I'm getting fired." So I get up and I go into his office. I sit down and I said, "Hey, what's going on? How can I help?" And he says, "You're about to go into Steve's office and you're going to pitch the account executive role for the Chicago office." And I think I just like went blank. I was like, "Excuse me? What do you mean?" I'm like, I I I'm not ready for that. Like I don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, "Ask the questions later. You're gonna go into his office right now and you're going to pitch this account executive role for the Chicago office." I was so confused. It was like 9:20 in the morning, and I had just been battling thoughts of like getting fired. And again, it had never crossed my mind that I would be applying for a role like that only 6 months after getting a promotion. It's a thought that just never crossed my mind. And of course, I wanted to be an account executive. Of course, that was in my plan, but not at that moment, not so soon. I definitely did not feel prepared. I did not have the experience. I had barely gotten into that sales planner role. So it's something that was not in my plans. But I said, okay, I'll go in and I'll do that. I asked no questions. I just went in, like he said. I knocked on the door. I sat down and I said, "Hey, so I heard about the Chicago account executive role, and I was expecting that he was going to ask me questions about the business, about Chicago, about the network, about my strategy, about all these things." And all he said to me was, "Have you ever been to Chicago?" I said, "No." And then he said, "Do you know where Chicago is?" And I said, "Yes, but honestly, I probably didn't know where Chicago was on the map." And then he said, "Do you want this job?" I said, "Yes, I want the job." And he's like, "It's yours. You're moving to Chicago." He's like, "You're going to make X amount of money and you'll move to Chicago in a month." And I want you to go in and talk to the Chicago sales manager. He's waiting to talk to you. And I was so confused. I was so incredibly confused because I don't know where any of this came from. At that moment, I had no idea where any of this came from. I had no idea why this was happening, why I had gotten so lucky in my life that this huge opportunity was now in front of me. All I knew was that I needed to say yes. But I knew in my heart that an opportunity like that does not come by very often, and that I was in front of a life changing moment for myself. I said yes. At the time, I did not negotiate the salary. As an assistant, you're not making a lot of money. And this was 2004. I was not making a lot of money. I was barely making probably a little bit more than minimum wage. So as a planner, I only got a little pay bump. But this opportunity was essentially tripling my salary, which was for me as a 24-year-old, it was a huge, huge, huge pay opportunity. And I was just like, I don't think I've ever been more ecstatic in my life than that moment, because it truly felt like a life changing moment. That interview, or whatever that was, a conversation, lasted maybe 10 minutes. And then I was just like almost paralyzed with shock. I go into my manager's office, Joe, and I said, he gave me the job. I'm moving to Chicago. I am in shock. I went into the next office and I met with the Chicago sales manager office, the person that would be my boss. And I sat in front of him, and it was like it was a done deal. You know, I was moving to Chicago to be part of his team. He didn't ask me any questions, anything about the business. It was just like, you're moving to Chicago, you learn everything you need to know. It's going to be a good, opportunity. And I went back to my cubicle. My manager, Joe, later told me that the head of sales had asked him for, who would be able to step into that role. And he said my name. He was always someone that was sponsoring me and supporting me and motivating me, and encouraging me to go for those type of positions, right? To always step up to the plate and do the work. And same thing with my mentor. Her name is Charity. And she was also always speaking positively about me in front of people, recommending my work, and just promoting with excitement the things I was able to do with her and the work that we're able to do together. And so the job just didn't come out of nowhere. It came from people just talking, speaking positively. Truly a career opportunity that changed my life. As someone who was 24, still living with my dad and my sister at the time in New York and Brooklyn, the first thing I thought about was, oh my God, what are my parents going to say? I'm moving to another state. I'm leaving New York, moving to another state by myself. I don't know anyone in Chicago. I had no friends, no family. I didn't know anyone there. I feel like that was the time in my life when I realized that you really always have to be ready for opportunities to show up at your doorstep. Obviously, we're spending our careers getting prepared, working very hard, learning as much as we can, creating a network around us. Just doing all these things, because we want to grow. We want to climb that ladder. But sometimes the most wonderful career opportunities show up unexpectedly. And when that happens, what are you going to do? Are you going to say yes, or are you going to feel afraid? So that was the first time that I realized, okay, I guess I have to be ready for these things to happen. And I'm so glad that I said yes on the spot without even thinking about it. Why wouldn't I move to Chicago? Why wouldn't I take this promotion? Why wouldn't I take triple my pay? Why wouldn't I take the opportunity? And so it ended up being not as easy as you can imagine, because moving to another city at my age was not easy. This was 2006. I was turning 25. So very young, very inexperienced. I obviously had a village behind me. My friends came to Chicago to help me find an apartment. My sister then came to Chicago to help me move. My family obviously rallied around me and helped me through that move, and obviously supported me through the decision. I got to Chicago, and I very quickly make friends with people in the office. Chicago is one of these places that it's just very welcoming. People in Chicago were very nice and very sweet, and definitely a little bit softer than people in New York. And I got to experience that when I moved there. The people in the office were great people. NBC in Chicago and the Telemundo office, the local teams. It was truly a wonderful office experience. The work itself was very challenging because, again, I didn't have the experience to step into this role. So I had to kind of learn very quickly and try to catch up very quickly. I didn't get any training. I didn't get any training at all. My training was like calling my friends in New York and asking, hey, how do I do this? Hey, how do I think about that? Hey, how do I negotiate? Hey, help me here. How do I write an email to this client? How do I, how do I, think about new leads? How do I introduce myself? Like I was so green. And my mentors in New York really helped me. Some of the people in Chicago really helped me. And the clients were wonderful people. I stayed in that role for about 6 years before I moved on to the next opportunity, which I'll talk about in the next episode. The job itself was truly a masterclass in growing up. Again, I was only 25 years old. So growing up very quickly, stepping into your own, finding your way in a new city, figuring out, in your career that, you can do hard things, and just like giving yourself an opportunity to step out of your comfort zone. So we'll go into the lessons that I learned in this role. So the first lesson is, take the leap, even when you've never been there before. In this case, new city, new everything. And I know it can be very scary, but sometimes these are the opportunities that become your biggest testament and your biggest learning experience. The second lesson is trust that you'll always figure it out. There was a period in those years of my career where it was really hard for me to figure it out. It was really hard for me to get sales, for me to get clients to respond to my emails, to give me meetings. Sometimes I would go home and cry almost every day. I think there was a few weeks where I went home crying every single day because it just felt very hard. I just felt very alone and very lost. And I kept always thinking, what am I doing? Why did I take this job? Because then after you say yes, you have to deal with the consequences, right? But that doesn't last forever. You always figure it out. I think the most important thing is understanding that you are not alone. Even if you feel like you're alone, you have people that you can tap into. And knowing who those people are is very important. And, you make yourself resourceful and you always figure it out, no matter what. The third lesson that I learned from that experience is even if the worst case scenario happens, you can always go home. And, I don't think I got close to worst case scenario ever, thank God. But my family kept always telling me, you can always come home. If something goes wrong, you can always come home. And you need to identify what that home is for you. Is it like a physical family home that you can go back to? Is it going back to be with friends? Like what is the going back home for you? I know it's not always easy after you make a big decision and people have expectations and you see yourself in a way and then maybe things change. I know it's not easy to think I can't go home. Like I have to prove this, right? And I never got close to that, right? To making that decision. But I knew that, okay, if this doesn't work out, If the tears continue, if the heaviness continues, I can always go home. So let's talk about lesson number 4, which is find your tribe wherever you go. And my tribe for me was a combination of people that I had worked with in New York, people that I started working with in Chicago. It was also clients in Chicago, people that I knew. There was a lot of young people that I was working with. I worked with this advertising agency. At the time, it was obviously Publicis, but it was Tapestry. They changed the name, but there was a lot of young people there that we all got along and were always trying to, stick together, support each other. I met new friends as well in this new community that I was in. So understanding that just because you move to a new place doesn't mean that you're losing the tribe that you come from, the places that you come from, right? But that you have to invest in creating a new community wherever you go, not just because obviously it's beneficial in case you need something, when you need support, when you're feeling alone. You need to have that community there to support you, and in the same way you support others. But it's just, important in your career to have these communities in different places. And for me, in my career for 22 years, I think that's been one of the biggest gifts for me, is just being able to have different communities of people everywhere I go. The 5th lesson, and probably I would say the most important, is leave some room for wonderful things to happen in your career. Like I said before, sometimes we overplan our careers. Sometimes we spend so much time, thinking about the next move, planning the next move, wanting the title, wanting the pay, wanting the company, that we don't dream enough. I would walk around at Telemundo. I would see account executives walking around me, and I would say, I'm gonna be like them one day. And one day, I even said to myself, I'm gonna be the youngest salesperson on the sales floor. And it's a thought that I just had. It just came to my mind. I don't know why. I talk a lot about how I sometimes manifest things into my life. And I said that one day, and it definitely came true. I was the youngest AE at Telemundo in those years. And leaving room for wonderful things to happen in your career is so important, because then we kind of surrender to know that anything wonderful can happen at any moment. And that morning, as I was walking into the office, I don't know what the universe was thinking, but I was definitely not in the mindset of getting a promotion, but it happened. So imagine if you're having your worst day, a miracle can happen, something great can come to your door, and you just have to be ready. So leave room for amazing things to happen in your career and have fun. When I look back at my Chicago experience, what I love most is that I tried to have fun. I tried to learn. I grew. I moved around a lot in Chicago. I had beautiful apartments because the rent is so much cheaper there. And I enjoyed that experience so much. And it was definitely one of those moments in my career that I look back and I smile. So as you're planning your careers, as you're, thinking about what's next, just think big as you can, as like sometimes as delusional as you can be. And maybe it happens. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I cannot wait for you to listen everything else that's in store for this mini series. Thank you again for listening to the podcast, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you for listening to the Mujeres Create podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to share the wisdom with other mujeres.